Good morning. I'm Hale Esfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to welcome back Trita Parsi, who is the president of the National Iranian American Council and a former public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. He wrote part of the book, am I right, at the center. In 2010, he received the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Mr. Parsi is frequently consulted by Western and Asian governments on foreign policy matters. A single roll of the dice, Obama's diplomacy with Iran is fresh out of the press, and I strongly recommend that you should read it because it is really a gripping book full of information, solid research, and very much talked about. There has been the Atlantic, is it the Atlantic Monthly, published some part of the book. The Economist reviewed the book, and Dr. Parsi wrote a piece for the Salon.com yesterday. It's called How Obama Became Vulnerable on Iran. So he's going to speak for half an hour, and then we'll open the floor to your questions, and then he will sign books. Could I please ask you to close your cell phone? No text messaging, please, for an hour, and Blackberries, iPhones, because it interferes with our live webcast. Thank you very much. Yes, the speaker too. Okay.
Thank you so much, Hal. It's a great pleasure being here. I'm tremendously grateful to the center and to Hale personally for providing me the opportunity to get some peace of mind during the summer of 2010 and access to some brilliant research assistants that played a very critical role in ensuring that this book could be written. I want to warn you beforehand, this is going to be a pretty depressive session. If you're already suffering from depression, I won't be hurt if you leave, but I actually advise you to do so. This is not going to cheer you up. The book is about the Obama administration's Iran policy. It was conceived of during the summer of 2009, that it would be very interesting to do an account on exactly what happened. Obama, of course, came in on the promise of diplomacy. See why it ended up in the manner that it did, and it is based on a large number of interviews with Obama administration officials from essentially all of the active actors in this issue, ranging from the Turks and the Brazilians to the P5 states, the Europeans, the Israelis, the Saudis, and of course the Iranians, including, in that case, the Iranian negotiators themselves. So before any further ado, let me go straight to a quote from Obama himself. To the Muslim world, we seek a new way forward, based on mutual interest and mutual respect. To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist. Only 12 and a half minutes into his presidency, Barack Obama reached out to Iran, offering America's hand of friendship if the Iranians were willing to unclench their fist. This was a bold move, but not one born out of desire, but rather born out of necessity. As far as we know, there was no childhood dream of Obama to necessarily negotiate with the Ayatollahs of Iran, but rather as a result of the policies of the Bush administration, a situation had been created in which increasingly it was sensed that peace or some sort of an arrangement with Iran was necessary in the region. The Bush administration, of course, pursued an ideological foreign policy, one in which one of its tenets was that talking to your enemies would empower them, would legitimize them, that diplomacy with other states would only be reserved for those who actually deserved America's company. Whatever one's view is of that ideological tenet, the track record, I think, is quite clear and undisputable. During the 8 years that the Bush administration was in power, the Iranian influence in the region grew significantly. They started off with something around 50 centrifuges when Bush came into power, and once that he left, they had approximately 8,000 or so. Iran had deep enmity with Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan. By the time Bush left office, Iran was the kingmaker of the political order in those two countries. He had expanded his influence in Lebanon and elsewhere as well. Against this backdrop, candidate Obama made something quite unprecedented. He made a promise that diplomacy with America's foes would be a central tenet of his platform of foreign policy that he would pursue. And diplomacy with Iran in particular became the poster child of that platform. And what, under normal circumstances, would have been viewed as political suicide, particularly in an election year, in 2008 actually became a winning card precisely because of the American population's rejection of the Bush foreign policy and the ideological foundation that it relied on. Now, what Obama recognized coming into the office, though, was that this unprecedented but yet limited political opening and space that he had been granted to pursue this policy would not last forever. It probably wouldn't last more than a year or so. So time was short, something needed to be done. The Iranians were continuing with their nuclear program. One of the critical things was that they were amassing low-enriched uranium, and as soon as they were close to reaching the amount needed in order to be able to build the bomb, the fear was that the administration would be under increased pressure to actually take military action. But from the very outset, even though many of the US's allies felt that Obama's new approach was refreshing, they were open to it, after a while it also became quite clear that there was a lot of hesitation and in fact some outright opposition to the idea of diplomacy with Iran among some key American allies. The Israelis were quite opposed to the idea, very nervous, that in a deal the United States would agree to enrichment in Iran, which would violate the Israeli red line and in their assessment shift the balance of power in the region in a detrimental way for Israel. The Saudis as well were quite fearful that a rapprochement between the United States and Iran would bring back the type of arrangement that existed in the region during the time of the Shah, the fear of a Persian hegemony in the Persian Gulf. Amongst the Europeans, largely this Obama's new line was quite welcome, but there was also a lot of hesitation and apprehension among some key states, such as France, such as Britain, who were fearful that Obama might be so eager to strike a nuclear deal that he would be too flexible when it comes to the red lines that the West could agree upon. Among America's key allies, many of them wished Obama well, but very, very few actually wished him success. As he stepped in, he recognized that after 30 years of institutionalized enmity in which too many people in the bureaucracies of Iran and the United States had made their careers based on as much negativity as possible vis-a-vis each other, a language that under no circumstances were conducive to problem solving, but rather were the language of conflict and war. The first task was to try to change the atmospherics between the United States and Iran. Trying to create an atmosphere, a language, a tone that would be more conducive to the success of diplomacy. And the most critical measure that Obama did there was, of course, the 2009 March Nowruz greeting, a taped 3.5-minute recording that was aired on the internet and on VOA, targeting both the Iranian government and the Iranian people, saying things that were quite unprecedented, speaking of the need for the two countries to overcome their enmity, speaking of the fact that this enmity could not be overcome through threats alone, a clear departure from the approach of the Bush administration, referencing the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was widely interpreted as a signal of the United States that it was no longer seeking regime change in Iran. And of course declaring that ultimately the United States would like to see Iran take its position amongst the community of nations. The Iranian response was very swift. Within a day, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, gave a presentation, a speech in Mashhad, his hometown, in which he spent approximately 40 minutes of that speech just going over all of the crimes that the United States had committed against Iran from the Iranian perspective. Towards the end, however, a small opening was given in which Khamenei pointed out that Iran does not have any experience with its new administration. It's not convinced that it's capable of changing this 30-year-old policy. But if the US changes, so will Iran. But the emphasis was on change, meaning a change of tone is not sufficient. It needed to be a change of policy in order for the Iranians to take it seriously. The administration finishes Iran review by April and then is debating whether to talk to the Iranians before or after their elections. Eventually, the decision was to wait until after the elections on June 12th. But the expectation in the White House was that by June 12th or June 13th, the day after the elections, some level of political clarity would exist. And they would know who would be taking over, and they would know who to reach out to, and hopefully within a couple of weeks, the diplomacy could begin. Already 6 months of that first year that was predicted to be the open window had already passed. What they did not expect, however, of course, was the fraud that took place in the elections and the massive human rights abuses that followed, that were there for everyone to see on the TV screens, and the political infighting and paralysis that followed in Iran as a result of this. The Iranian elite essentially was at war with itself as well, one could argue, with the Iranian people. And under those circumstances, was very few prospects of success for diplomacy, and even more time was feared that now was being lost as a result of this. But something had happened only 10 days before the elections that had really rejuvenated the view in the White House that there could be a diplomatic opening that could be seized upon. On June 2nd, the Iranians, 10 days before the elections, the Iranians send a request to al-Baradei, the head of the IAEA, saying that they have run out of fuel for their Tehran research reactor, a reactor that was producing medical isotopes for about 850,000 cancer patients in Iran. The Iranians requested to buy fuel for that. Al-Baradei recognized the opportunity and did not do what protocol required him to do, which is to inform all of the different supplier nations that there is this request for buying this. Instead, he only informed the United States and Russia. And in the White House, this was seen as an opening because they had already spent some time thinking about what can the US do to convince the Iranians to give up some of its low-enriched uranium. If that count could be reduced, more time and space could be won for diplomacy. Now suddenly, the Iranians themselves were offering something that could be turned around into that type of a win-win concept. Because one could take the Iranian LEU and turn it into the fuel rods for the research reactor, and that way the Iranians would get what they wanted, and the United States would get additional time and space for diplomacy by reducing Iran's breakout capability. Immediately, the administration begins talking about this with the Russians. It's not held up by the election crisis, but it's delayed in the manner in which it could be pursued. But by September, there is a decision that simply there wasn't any compelling reason to wait. There was no clarity as to when Iran's political crisis would be over. And it could take so long so that the window for diplomacy in Washington would be closed. So by end of September, or early September, Iran is informed that there is a requirement for them to show up at a meeting with the P5+1 in which the US would participate in order to discuss a proposal that only vaguely had been explained to the Iranians beforehand. On October 1st, they meet in Geneva, and the proposal is presented to the Iranians, an idea of taking their LEU for their and get fuel pads in return. To many people's surprise, the Iranians in principle accepted the idea and accepted to meet soon again within a couple of weeks to discuss the details. That was to take place on 19th of October in Vienna. And there the problems began, because then the actual details of the proposal are spelled out to the Iranians in a manner that did not take place on October 1st. The US-Russian proposal, which now had been adopted by al-Baradei and was referred to as the al-Baradei proposal, essentially stated that the Iranians would give up 1,200 kilos of low-enriched uranium in one shipment to be sent to Russia for re-enrichment to about 20% and then sent to France for the production of the fuel pads. The Iranians would then, approximately 9 months to 12 months later, get the fuel pads. Here is where the Iranians start objecting. First of all, in their view, if all of it is to be put out in one shipment, that would mean that Iran, in their view, would take the greater risk. It would take 12 months before they got something back, so most of the risk is on the Iranian shoulders. Secondly, they made the case that in Geneva, nothing had been mentioned about France being involved in the process. Iran has a very negative past with France when it comes to some past nuclear activities and collaborations. And the first day of the negotiations was actually spent mainly by the Iranians trying to get the French out of the deal. The compromise that was found is that the French would become a Russian headache in the sense that they would be subcontracted by the Russians rather than being actually a signatory to the deal itself. Beyond that, the Iranians did not want to have the exchange take place outside of Iranian soil. Again, they wanted a guarantee, a mechanism that would guarantee that if they were to give this up in one shipment rather than having 3 shipments, for instance, there would be a guarantee that they would not be, that the West would not renege on the deal, because the fear, mindful of the fact that the Iranian suspicion of the West and mistrust of the West is essentially equal to the Western suspicion of Iran, they felt that too much of the risk was on their shoulders. By the end of the third day, it was clear that neither side was really changing their positions in any significant manner. And al-Baradei had a choice, either going out and declaring that the talks had failed, or to give it one last shot and ask the different states to take this back to their capitals in order for them to come back with a proper response 3 days later. Everyone agreed in a gentleman's agreement that that is what they would do, and they would not say anything negative about the deal publicly. By the time they went back to the capitals, Russia, France, and the US very quickly accepted essentially their own deal, which wasn't particularly difficult for them to do. The Iranians, however, never come back with either a yes or a no. There's a request for additional meetings, additional technical meetings to work out some of the details, further insistence on finding mechanisms that would guarantee that they essentially would not be left out in the cold. By end of November, the Obama administration essentially makes the decision that diplomacy has run its course and that the sanctions track would be activated, meaning that after having tried diplomacy, having nothing to show for it, the U.S. would now move towards a sanctions path and try to get UN security sanctions imposed on Iran in what was called then, of course, the dual-track policy, that we would pursue both sanctions and diplomacy at the same time. The expectation was that by sometimes in February, perhaps, when the French were holding the presidency of the Security Council, the sanctions resolution would be adopted, and Obama could show that not only did he try diplomacy, but very swiftly he could impose sanctions on the Iranians if the Iranians were not playing ball. That expectation did not pan out because resistance from Russia and China to the sanctions draft were quite extensive. More time was lost. In the meantime, the Obama administration is under pressure from Congress. Congress is trying to impose their own sanctions. There's a fear in the administration if Congress imposes sanctions before the administration, then the very critical unity within the P5 would be lost. And Iran would once again be able to play the various key states in the P5 against each other, as it had somewhat successfully done during the Bush administration, in which there wasn't that sense of consensus within the P5. By April, things started to get really nervous. Of course, hanging over the administration throughout this period was pressure from Israel and a potential risk that the Israelis would take military action. But 2 states in the Security Council decided to adopt their own approach and try to see if they could find a way to get the Iranians to agree to the deal. Turkey and Brazil, who had their own reasons to be involved in this, and I won't go into that in too great of detail in the talk, but it's referenced in the book, felt strongly that there was still a chance for diplomacy to succeed. On May 16th, President Lula of Brazil travels to Iran. A day later, Erdogan of Turkey shows up. They have an 18-hour marathon negotiation, at times very tense negotiations with the Iranians, in order to get them to agree to the benchmarks of the deal that had been put on the table 6 months earlier. to everyone's surprise, after 18 hours, they had an agreement. The Iranians would give up 1,200 kilos in one shipment. The exchange would take place outside of Iranian soil. The fuel rods would be given back to the Iranians about a year to a year and a half afterwards. The difference was, of course, that the Iranian LEU actually would sit in escrow in Turkey. So in case the West reneged on the deal, the Iranians could take back their strategic asset in the LEU. And because trust and confidence and leverage between Iran and Turkey was quite different from that between Iran and the other P5 states, this was a proposal that, in fact, President Obama himself on April 13th, a month earlier, had endorsed in a conversation with Erdogan, Lula, Amorim, and Davutoglu in Washington, D.C. during the Nuclear Zero Summit. Of course, the Turks and the Brazilians were quite ecstatic. They had managed to pull off a major diplomatic feat, something that, of course, the Europeans had failed to do for quite some time. But what they did not know, that on the Friday before the Sunday that Lula arrived in Tehran, China and Russia had already agreed to a sanctions draft in the Security Council for UN sanctions on Iran. So by the time Amorim calls Secretary Clinton after his first flight out of Tehran and explains this quite excitedly to the secretary that the deal was successful, he was quite stunned to hear that the U.S. rejected it, because the U.S. government immediately informed the Brazilians and the Turks that this was not acceptable. And in the conversation, Secretary Clinton raises two key concerns, being that, one, the Iranians now actually had enriched far more uranium than they had in October 2009. In October 2009, they had 1,500 kilos of LEU. Taking 1,200 out of it would constitute 75%. The Iranians would only have 300 left, which is insufficient to be able to build a bomb. By May 2010, the Iranians had approximately 2,400 kilos of LEU. If you take 1,200 kilos out of that, they still have 1,200 kilos, which is sufficient, theoretically, to be able to build a bomb. Furthermore, the Iranians had, in the Western perspective, escalated by also starting 20% enrichment in May 2010, and this was not addressed by the deal. Amorim objects, however, in that conversation and says, but none of this was mentioned in the letter that President Obama sent to Lula and Erdogan in April 20th, 2010. There's a silence. There's no response from Secretary Clinton, and I didn't get a chance to interview her, but Amorim's interpretation was that perhaps she actually didn't know about the letter. The letter that I'm referencing is a letter that President Obama had sent to Lula and to Erdogan on April 20th, only 3 weeks before they actually traveled to Tehran, in which there is no mention of the 20%, and there is a specific reference that it would be a significant confidence-building measure that would lie in the U.S.'s interest if 1,200, not more, 1,200 kilos of LEU is taken out of Iran and put in an escrow in Turkey. So why did the United States then reject this deal, particularly in such a swift and rather undiplomatic manner? Because Secretary Clinton is in a Senate hearing on Tuesday after the Sunday deal, in which she announces that we now have an agreement on sanctions resolution in the Security Council. And then she adds, this is the clearest response to what happened during this past weekend. Well, I think there's several different reasons. I think the facts on the ground changing is one factor, but those are, of course, disputed by the letter of Obama himself. And I think it's not unfair to expect that the Brazilians and the Turks would view the letter of the president as the final position of the U.S. government on this. But essentially what had happened is that the Obama administration had run out of political space to be able to fight for this deal and take on Congress and all of the pressures that were coming from Congress in order to pass sanctions. There was a fear that if they accepted the deal, Congress would go forward with their own sanctions anyways, because the momentum in Congress was unstoppable. And as a result, the deal itself would have very little value, because you would now have a conflict within the P5, because the congressional sanctions would be targeting the U.S. as allies in the Security Council. Essentially, adopting the sanctions became the organizing principle for alliance management within the P5. consensus within and keeping that consensus in the P5 was absolutely essential for the larger Obama strategy. And this was particularly important, mindful of the fact that in order to get the Russians and the Chinese to agree to a deal, significant concessions had to be given to the Russians on various issues, from NATO expansion to missile defense and other things. But all of that was predicated on the acceptance of a Security Council resolution. If that then was pulled out, then many of these other deals could potentially fall apart. So Iran, in some ways, actually was not at the center of this as much as the alliance management in the Security Council was. The issue of political space, interestingly enough, really becomes, I think, a critical component of the Obama administration's Iran policy. The title of the book, A Single Roll of the Dice, is actually a quote from an Obama administration official who explained the policy of having become a gamble on a single roll of the dice. It either had to work right away in October 2009 or not at all. We didn't have the political space to be able to show the type of patience, persistence, invest the type of political capital that usually is needed in order to make a negotiation of this kind succeed. And let's not forget, we're talking about a problem that beyond the nuclear issue is an institutionalized enmity between two states that has lasted for 30 years. The expectation that this could be done over negotiations over 2-3 weeks is quite unrealistic, but I think the administration pursued it because at the time they felt that that was the best that they could do. If you compare this to the type of negotiations that the US government has successfully pursued, you see a quite different pattern. For instance, the negotiations between Vietnam and the United States over rapprochement and reestablishment of diplomatic relations after the war took place over the course of 4 years, between 1990 and 1994. Actually over the course of 2 presidencies, another 6 years for a full trade agreement. The negotiations with Libya that successfully had them capitulate their nuclear program took place over the course of 7 years, during which long periods of time the talks were actually suspended because of a lack of success. When Senator Mitchell was negotiating or mediating the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, he has a wonderful quote on Charlie Rose's show in which he said, "For the first 700 days, both sides told me that they would not agree to anything the other side would agree to. On the 701st day, they both changed their minds." Fortunately, Senator Mitchell did not give up with those first 700 days, of which, incidentally, Sinn Féin didn't even show up for several months, wasn't even at the table. To succeed with diplomacy, you need to invest the type of political capital and courage. And in the case of the administration, I think if any criticism that I would like to express today over the failure is, I think from the very outset, the administration felt that talking to Iran was a winning card in the elections. But once becoming president, there's only one instance that I can find in which the president actually spells out the strategic logic for negotiations with Iran. Compare that to President Bush. He gave 16 major speeches between January 2002 and March 2003, putting forward, in my view, the flawed logic of going into Iraq. Another 11 major interviews with major outlets, media outlets, knowing very well that if you want to get your policy, you need to create a political space to be able to pursue it. That was not in any significant or consistent manner done by the administration, and a large part of that was actually what happened in the Iranian elections. The massive human rights abuses there was, in my assessment, the biggest blow to the administration's political space and their own moral conviction that this is a policy that they would like to pursue and that they could honestly defend in front of the American public. But bottom line is that we're now here 2 years or so later after the Brazilian-Turkish intervention. We chose sanctions over diplomacy, and we are paradoxically, in my assessment, and I end on this extremely unhappy note, probably closer to a military confrontation than we were during the last years of the Bush administration. Not because there is any desire, in my assessment, in the Obama administration for a war. On the contrary, I think there isn't. But because we have now pursued a policy which trajectory is leading us to that, and most likely as a result of an accident, because we don't have any de-escalatory mechanisms. We don't have any functioning diplomacy. And under these circumstances, as Admiral Mike Mullen said right before he left office, as the chairman of Joint Chief of Staff. When you don't have that communication for 30 years, you do misread and misunderstand the other side's signal. When you misread, you miscalculate. And when you miscalculate, you escalate. And that's where we are right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You got a gist of the book, and you see how gripping it is in reading it. We now open the floor for your questions. Trita, but the Iranians didn't show any willingness really to reciprocate every time the administration reached out to them. So it is not that you have an administration at this end that unilaterally move from the idea of engagement to what might be a possibility of confrontation. I mean, there is the other side too, and I think we were discussing it before coming down, that Iran has also many center of decision making, and they just can't make up their minds.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I described that in detail in the book, how frustrating that became for the United States, particularly when it came to the issue of what should we do now? Should we sweeten the deal? Should we wait? What can be done? Time was of the essence. The Iranian nuclear program was progressing in spite of the political paralysis in Iran. And most officials that I've spoken to do believe that the political infighting in Iran was the key reason as to why the Iranians didn't say yes, even though they had arguments as to why they were taking a bigger risk, etc. Bottom line is, in order to make peace, you have to be willing to take a greater, at least an equal amount of risk for peace as you are willing to take a risk for war or for a continued stalemate. I would say that the Iranians certainly have not been innocent of accepting a greater risk for confrontation or for a stalemate than taking that extra step, sticking out their neck for a deal. But on the flip side of that is that in 2010, Turkey and Brazil managed, because of a different approach to diplomacy, getting the Iranians to put their signature on the paper. One of the requirements that the U.S. had, together with its allies, in order as a measurement as to whether the Iranians are serious or not, is that if there is an agreement, it needs to be in writing, it needs to be signed, and it needs to be sent to the IAEA within 7 days, which is exactly then what the Iranians did on the 2010 proposal agreement. But at that time, we were in an opposite situation in the United States. Now, we were having that difficulty. Administration was suffering from the lack of political space and could not come to an agreement. I do agree that, the deal of 2010 does not have the same attractiveness on a non-proliferation scale as it would have in 2009. But we also should not forget, this was never supposed to be the end of the negotiations. This was an American idea. It was supposed to be a confidence-building measure. In a real negotiation, if a confidence-building measure doesn't work, you try another one. And you have to muster the political will on both sides to overcome whatever flaws in the deal or whatever roadblocks on the road. None of the negotiations that the U.S. have succeeded with have been so because the deal was flawless, because the other side didn't cheat, because we fully trusted them, because of all of these wonderful things. They were successful because we managed and they managed to overcome all of those flaws because of a political and strategic recognition that it was better to get a deal than to continue with the status quo.
Floor is open. Yes, please. Yes.
Paul Kerr, Congressional Research Service. I was wondering, Trita, if you could speak a little more about why the Turkish and Brazilian approach succeeded where the other approaches failed, particularly in how they managed to overcome or work with the divisions within the Iranian government.
Thank you, Paul. I think there's a couple of things, and I think if there ever is another opportunity, we should study what the Turks and the Brazilians did. Because I think it could be quite valuable for us. Now, we have to recognize neither Turkey nor Brazil face the type of domestic political limitations that the U.S. does, which makes it much easier for them to pursue this in a more sustained fashion. Just to name a few of them. the Turks and the Brazilians actually recognized clearly that the 2009 deal had largely fallen apart because of the political infighting in Iran. The Ahmadinejad faction had not been particularly open to the parliament about what was in the deal, and even if that hadn't taken place, mindful of the infighting at the time, no other faction was willing to give Ahmadinejad a success. And they were doing everything they could to make sure that this was a failure. Even if it would go forward, that it would be viewed as a failure in order for him not to get any positives out of that. What they did is that they actually engaged almost every power center. Both Davutoglu and Amorim were going in and out of Iran for several months prior to the president's arriving there in May. Negotiating with Larijani, the head of the parliament, negotiating with people from the Khamenei's office to the presidency, the foreign ministry, engaging all of them in order to reduce the likelihood of that the very chronicle factionalism in Iran would not hamper the deal. Secondly, we have to be very honest, the first clause in the deal explicitly recognizes Iran's right to enrichment. And this is something that particularly the French had great difficulties with, because they don't, from their read of the NPT, there is no such thing as a right to enrichment. And I pose that question to Amorim and to the Turks and say, you know very well how sensitive that point is to the West. Why would you agree to put that in an agreement, particularly as the first clause? Didn't you recognize that this would potentially make it a non-starter? The response was, well, this is not an agreement between the United States, France, and Iran. This is an agreement between Turkey, Brazil, and Iran, 3 states that have a long history of explicitly recognizing that there is such a thing as a right to enrichment. That deal would then get the Iranians to agree to shipping out their LEU, which is all that the U.S. actually wanted, according to the letter. Thirdly, the amount of diplomacy that went in to getting the deal, beyond just the 18 hours of direct negotiations, is essentially so that between November 2009 and May 2010, the Turks and the Brazilians were talking more to the Iranians and with the Iranians than the entire P5+1 combined. And I think that actually goes a long way of showing that what it is that makes diplomacy work. Now, going forward, I think it's going to be very, very difficult, because neither one of these 2 states came out of this experience feeling stronger or better than before, because they actually had a pretty low in their relationship with the United States as a result of the dispute of this. So right now, when I think there is a stalemate and there's a fear that neither side, neither the Iranians nor the West, can really show flexibility, particularly in an election year, there may be a need or a desire for some countries that perhaps have a more flexible relationship with both sides here to intervene, mediate, or do some confidence building. It's just very difficult to find any states that would be willing to take that risk, mindful of what happened in May 2010.
John, here, one.
John Limbert from U.S. Naval Academy. Trita, thank you for a very interesting account and a very interesting book. How do you answer a question that one hears in different forms quite frequently? And the question is this. Wasn't the administration determined from the beginning to avoid entering engagement with Iran? And the purpose of its policies was to show itself reasonable and show the Iranians as intransigent in order to build consensus among its allies for further sanctions and other steps against Iran. In other words, to say, well, we tried, but they are just too intransigent.
Thank you, John. This is an argument that I've heard only from 2 different places, and perhaps I haven't heard it. Few analysts in this town, very few, and then, of course, from the Iranian side, that from the very beginning, this was just a big conspiracy that the Obama administration managed to pull off. I have a hard time accepting this interpretation, because after all of the interviews I've done, not just with Obama administration officials, but others involved in this process, I've not at all seen any evidence that would support this. Certainly, and those who tend to argue this tend to point to either the fact that certain people were put in the White House who didn't necessarily have a long track record of supporting diplomacy, and I think that's a fair observation. That doesn't prove the conclusion. And secondly, arguing that this does not in any way, shape, or form resemble the type of an outreach that, for instance, Nixon did to China, as if that is the only formula that one can pursue in order to be convincing that it is serious. I think that's false. I think rather you see a much more complex picture in which you had a president that I personally believe genuinely desired this, and actually I still believe that he genuinely desires it. But from the very outset, seeing his policy vision be compromised, both by opposition from within the administration, opposition from Congress, from some of the allies, from unforeseen events such as the Iranian elections, and then the outcome at the end of this long process of waiting to pursue it ended up being something that I frankly personally believe is probably not what the president himself originally had hoped for. But this is the way process and policy works. It's very rarely one in which the inception, the original embryonic idea and the end result in any way, shape, or form actually resembles each other. To buy the argument that you presented, John, essentially would mean that all of the things that happened, the conflict between Netanyahu and Obama over this issue, the pressure from certain interest groups in Congress, all of it was just a big charade, because the president already had made up his mind that this was just a very clever scheme to give the impression of being reasonable. I personally I cannot ascribe to it absence any real evidence, and I've not come across any evidence that would support it.
Henry? Yes.
Henry Precht. From a public relations standpoint, didn't Mr. Obama face an impossible situation in having to deal with Ahmadinejad, who had been demonized? So they waited, hoping that he would not be elected. Then after the election, there was this disastrous confrontation with the street, making it even more difficult for him to negotiate with the Iranian president. He couldn't go effectively to Khamenei, who does not get into the business of daily negotiations. So really he had nowhere to turn. It's not a question of negotiation so much as it is handling the public relations in this country.
Henry, I think you're quite right in the sense that the public relations aspect, this is what I'm referring to as the political space, was extremely limited. And where I think the administration can be faulted is that if you really desire this policy, you have to create political space for it. There were moments during the summer of 2009 in which senior Democratic senators privately signaled the White House that we're willing to give you political cover, so you can have a more bold approach, that you can have a more sustainable approach. This was something that, in my understanding, based on the interviews, was favored by many people in the policy shop in the White House, but not favored by people in the political rank at the White House who felt that any national debate and dialogue about Iran policy ultimately would result negatively for the administration in the next elections. So as a result, when you make that decision, you are not out there actively creating space for your policy. To expect that the political landscape that has nurtured, perpetuated a 30-year-old enmity will be the same political landscape that will enable you to resolve it, I don't think is correct. You have to change that political landscape. Obama had an opening. I think he thought that he would just use that opening, and if he could get it quickly done, it would be successful. The only real calculation for expanding political space was to get a quick success on the confidence-building measure to show that, diplomacy can yield something, and then take the fight, but not to take a fight prior to that. And ultimately, that is what led to this situation. Now, one can make the counter-argument and say, well, mindful of the political chaos in Iran, even if they had tried it, perhaps it wouldn't have worked. But I think precisely because the difficulty of balancing a dual-track policy, as one of the officials I spoke to said, a train can't run on two tracks at the same time. Once there actually was an opening and we were so committed to sanctions, we couldn't shift back and actually take advantage of that opening.
In the back, please. Yes. Carol, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Carol Murphy. I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for a very informative presentation. You said that you unfortunately see us closer to a military confrontation than ever before, and this might happen through an accident, miscalculation. Could you tell us how that might happen and how it would relate? Say there's a boating accident in the Straits of Hormuz, how would that bring in the nuclear issue and the enrichment issue and justify bombing of their facilities? And what do you think the repercussions of a military strike would be?
On the first issue, once the administration decided to go for the sanctions track, one of the things that happened, one of the assumptions for the policy that was now adopted, as a rejection of the previous assumption that, softer language and opening could yield results, was the belief that had been argued for by some European states, some regional allies, which is that the only time in the last 10 years that the Iranians actually have made a significant concession was at a time when they were faced with a significant imminent military threat. The argument that the only reason the Iranians suspended and agreed to the additional protocol in 2003 was because of the invasion of Iraq, and as a result of that prompted the Iranians to give a concession. I have question marks about this assumption, but nevertheless, once that assumption was adopted, it essentially meant that we are now pursuing an approach in which we're trying to re-emulate that sense of an imminent military threat, in the hope that that will get the Iranians to the table and that it will soften them sufficiently so that they will agree to a deal that is meeting our minimum terms. The problem with this type of approach, of course, is that at best you can control your own actions, and I say at best because even we can, of course, miscalculate and misread. We have very little ability to control how the Iranians read our signals, that they understand what we're trying to do and that they don't miscalculate or misread it. In fact, an interview with people at the Pentagon, they expressed, on the one hand, support for this approach because this obviously puts the Pentagon a little bit at the center of the policy, but also a lot of frustration because in the U.S.'s interception of Iranian communications, we've drawn the conclusion that the Iranians really do not read our signals correctly almost ever. And thirdly, of course, either an unwillingness or incapability to control the actions of the Israelis in the middle of this mix. So we have essentially walked to the brink of war as a tactic or strategy, thinking that this will maximize our negotiating leverage, but in reality it may actually beget us war. And that's part of the reason I think you see a lot of concern in the White House. You certainly see it in the Pentagon. And I think the administration is actively trying to see what it can do to de-escalate the situation without necessarily losing this perception that we're very strong and ready. Saving Iranian fishermen in the Persian Gulf, for instance, is actually one component of this, and making sure that it gets a lot of media attention, etc., is part of the effort to de-escalate. When there is an Iranian scientist assassinated in the streets of Iran and the administration takes the unprecedented step of immediately going to the podium, having a senior official, in this case the Secretary of State, condemning it and categorically rejecting the American involvement, I think that also is part of the effort of trying to de-escalate because we recognize that we have gotten ourselves very, very close to a confrontation.
And we are taking the last two questions. Yes, sorry. The lady, Nana Mona. Yes, please. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Anna Sarban from Georgetown University. And I was just wondering whether, in the light of recent events, do you think it's possible to go back to negotiations, which is usually in international law is kind of a step back from where things are now? And, if you had to sort of brief President Obama right now on a policy, what would you recommend as an option of like a next step to this conflict or potential conflict?
The gentleman here, yes. We'll take the last three questions.
Several times last year, Ahmadinejad said that Iran would give up 20% enrichment if the fuel for the Tehran research reactor was supplied from the outside. What has happened to that suggestion? In fact, was it agreeable to other factions within the Iranian government?
And the lady in the back there.
Hi, my name is Sonia Schott with Global Vision Venezuela. I was wondering what is your read on the Iran presence in Latin America, especially the close ties with Venezuela? Thank you.
Okay, Cindy, last question.
Thanks, Cindy Arnson with the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. I was wondering if you could go back over a little bit why the Obama administration rejected the Brazilian and Turkish initiative. I mean, you could actually make the argument that the facts on the ground had changed, and that in the 6 months intervening, there had been a significant evolution of the capacity, in Iran to produce, nuclear fuel. So I was just wondering if you could. I understand the argument that you made about having gotten China and Russia, on board and trying to negotiate the politics of the Security Council. But I was wondering if you could comment some more on the merits of the argument that what had been put on the table and what was reiterated in April by President Obama, in fact, was no longer the situation.
Okay, Trita, 3 minutes.
All right. Okay. Very good.
5 minutes.
Quickly on some suggestions on to make the negotiations succeed. I think one of the issues I think would make it a little bit easier is if we have a more open conversation about what the end state of a negotiation is. Not necessarily in the sense of completely resolving it, because there may not be anything left to negotiate. But right now there is a perception, if you read Ashton's letter, I think the way the Iranians read the letter is that since it makes a reference to the implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions, the Iranians read that the end of the negotiations need to be an Iranian suspension, which they believe will end up into a cessation because they will never be able to get out of the suspension. So it doesn't seem to be something that they're going to be all too eager to enter into if that is the end game of the negotiations. The other thing, though, I think that is a real problem when it comes to making sure that there is that what we're putting on the table is of any value to the Iranians, is that I think we have had quite a disproportionate focus on the idea that our sticks have to be really, really credible, that we're willing to impose almost any sanctions. In fact, we have by now imposed almost any sanction that one can think of. I don't think there is a credibility problem on that end. I think the credibility problem is if the Iranians were to change their behavior, do we have the capability of lifting sanctions? And mindful of the fact that the U.S. sanctions overwhelmingly are passed through Congress, I think one can make a strong argument as to why it is not likely to have those sanctions lifted, at least not in a timely fashion. Other sanctions, such as the Iraq sanctions, were not fully lifted until 2010, 7 years after mission accomplished. So the European sanctions, I think, are more flexible in the sense because they are adopted by the executive branches. They can lift them much more easily. But going into the negotiations, if there is anything in February or March, which seems increasingly unlikely, the different ideas that have been discussed that I have been informed about still are very short of any actual lifting of sanctions in the initial phases, even though what is requested of the Iranian side is some rather significant steps. And I have a very hard time seeing that type of an approach succeeding. There has to be a picture and an idea of what the end state is and that the Iranians would have a face-saving way out. And in fact, I'll go as far as to say this. In my assessment, it seems like from a non-proliferation perspective, it is quite acceptable to have a solution in which the Iranians only enrich to 3.5% or 5%, limited to that, have full transparency with the additional protocol and other measures. And frankly, I don't see a lot of states that would view this being unacceptable. I think the Iranians could accept it. I think the Obama administration could accept it. The only states right now, in my assessment, that would believe that would be a violation of their red lines is Israel, Saudi Arabia, France, and the UK. But the rest of the international community, I think, would be able to live with that. And in fact, Europeans eventually probably would be as well. So it doesn't seem to me that this is a problem of such intellectual complexity that humankind has never come across before. Rather, no, this is a political problem, and that's where we are getting stuck. On the end of the 20%, that's actually part of it. This is one of the first requirements in a phased approach that the administration is looking at, to immediately end 20%, immediately end the activities in the Fordo plant, and to give up the existing stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. This is something the Iranians have offered, but I think they're obviously asking for something in return, and that's not clear what we would be able to offer them. On the issue of Venezuela, I have to admit I don't know too much about it. I'm under the impression that this seems to be somewhat of an exaggerated issue, in the sense that clearly there may be some political commonalities in challenging U.S. hegemony and the U.S.-led world order, but I've not gotten the impression that this is a particularly deep relationship and that actually could change quite dramatically if the Chavez government were to fall. On the Brazil-Turkey, I'll happy to go into greater detail. I think it's absolutely correct that from a non-proliferation perspective, this did not make as much sense that it would have made in 2009. But I think the weakness of that argument is that at the end of the day, I think it's fair to expect that it is the President of the United States that is the final decision maker. If that letter sent to Lula and Erdogan had been signed by a lower person in the administration, perhaps an intern, perhaps the argument would be correct that this is not the final word of the U.S. government. But if the U.S. president sends a letter and says, please help us get 1,200 kilos out of Iran, this would be a significant confidence-building measure of significant importance to our national interest, then I think it is fair to expect that the Brazilians and the Turks would go by what is in that letter. It has the signature of the president on it. And again, reminding ourselves, this was not supposed to be the end of the negotiations. From the very outset, the administration just wanted an opening, a quick victory, a confidence-building measure that would give them more political space and confidence to pursue the broader, much tougher negotiations. Treating this as the end, I think, is incorrect. And in fact, the administration itself used arguments against the deal that were arguments that were used against Obama's own proposal in 2009 by its critics, saying that this is putting the issue of enrichment for 20%, it's putting this issue as at the center of the nuclear issue, whereas in reality there are other more important factors. Or to say that this doesn't actually get us down to zero enrichment. Well, neither would the 2009 proposal. In fact, this was deliberately aimed at doing a confidence-building measure that wouldn't get to that, because that was the only thing that was deemed to be feasible. I think part of the problem is that the more we are viewing the Iran issue strictly from a non-proliferation perspective, which tends to be very legalistic, we create a significant limitation on our own flexibility and our own maneuverability to find creative solutions. And I think on the Iran issue, increasingly, it's become almost all non-proliferation and very much less of other issues. Even at the talks in October, the only time in which other issues were really raised was during a 45-minute exchange between Secretary Burns and Saeed Jalili, in which some other issues were raised, including the case of 3 Americans that were jailed in Iran on a human rights basis. But other than that, all we really talked about and have been talking about is non-proliferation. The toughest of all of the conflicts between the U.S. and Iran, the one that has the greatest propensity of becoming a zero-sum type of a negotiation.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Trita
Thank
Parsi.
you.
And